For this next slide, I decided to add some cases that I felt were really important and they really help shape what we know of segregation today. For starters, there were the Jim Crow laws. These were laws that enforced racial segregation. So this was kind of like the beginning of segregation, and these laws really enforced the idea of racial segregation. Next, I included the Dred Scott versus Sanford case. In 1857, the Supreme Court concluded that Dred Scott, who was a slave, could not live in a free state where slaves were prohibited. They ruled that he was not entitled to freedom and that African Americans could never be U.S. citizens. Next, I included the Plessy versus Ferguson case. In this one, the Supreme Court determined that racial segregation in public places were legal as long as they were equal, and this happened in 1896. Also, because of this case, they created the separate but equal doctrine that would last for the next 6 decades. And they also ruled that it was legal to ban African Americans from riding the bus, attending schools, and also attending pretty much any public facility along with whites. So they banned African Americans from anywhere where the privileged white people would be. And then another very, very important case was the Brown versus Board of Education. For this one, the Supreme Court in 1954 determined that racial segregation in schools was unconstitutional. This case helped establish the idea of separate but equal and the fact that it was not equal at all. The starters of this case was Oliver Brown, who filed a lawsuit against a Board of Education of Topeka when his daughter, Linda Brown, was denied access to an all-white public elementary school. He claimed that white and black schools were not, in fact, equal. So thanks to him, he brought this issue to light, and they were able to rule the idea of segregation in schools to be unconstitutional. And then lastly, I wanted to include this one. It was a Jenkins versus Bogalusa case. For this one, he was the first African American student who attended the white Bogalusa High School in 1967. In an article I read that he described his experience as being horrible, so I'm sure most of us would assume that this event of him actually getting into the white privileged schools would be an amazing experience, but he actually explained that it was so bad because the black community would tease him and would say really, really hurtful things to him because they felt like he was better than them. And then obviously the white schools were just really, really horrible to him because he was African American. Now in the previous slide, I mentioned that both schools, the African American schools and the white schools, were completely different as far as the resources that they had. So an example of that was in 1951, a group of students attending a civics class in a segregated black school, the school was Atkin High School, shared in an interview that before working on an assignment, they looked at the resources that they were provided, and they compared it to the resources that the white privileged schools had, and they realized that they were not equal at all. So what they did was they actually started a student protest. So there was no adults involved, just students, where they went to the local school board and expressed to them their thoughts on inequality and the lack of funding that they received. But of course, they were ignored. So the students continued to protest and refused to go back to school for a week. And 18 months later, the school was renovated and they built a new gymnasium. But however, it still remained segregated until 1970.